But I think, India would resist making the Quad more of a security or defense forum, at least publicly. India has two reasons for that. It doesn't want to provoke China and see another, border crisis like 2020. But also, I think India wants to maintain the soft power credentials of the Quad with the other Indo-Pacific nations. I think India realizes it's important to maintain support for the Quad among the Southeast Asian nations and other nations of the region.
Hello and welcome to the gist for StratNews Global. This is Nayanima Basu. Today we have a very special guest, Ms. Lisa Curtis. Ms. Curtis was there in the Trump administration in the first tenure in the National Security Council. Today, she's with a think tank dealing with foreign policy, defense, and strategic affairs called the Center for a New American Security, that is CNAS, and we are going to understand from her where exactly the India-US bilateral relationship is headed. The focus is of course on tariff, but of course there will be a renewed focus on Indo-Pacific under the Trump administration 2.0 and also very much on defense. Welcome to the gist.
Thank you. It's great to be with you again.
Thank you so much, Ms. Curtis. So let me start with the very first thing that's the flavor now in the India-US bilateral relationship, which is the tariff war, so to say, a trade war. While, the discussion is mostly centered around US and China with the kind of tariffs they're imposing on each other, where do you see it is headed as far as India is concerned? Because in India, there is this larger kind of goal right now to sign the Bilateral Trade Agreement, the BTA, that was agreed upon when Prime Minister Modi was there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of President Trump's global tariffs, India is actually ahead of the game in terms of the trade talks. Look, Prime Minister Modi had already agreed to reduce some of India's tariffs even before he came to the United States and had his meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office in February. So I think, Prime Minister Modi knew President Trump. He dealt with him for 4 years during his first term. The US and India had tried to negotiate a trade deal. At that time, it didn't happen. But I think that the Indian government realized that this Trump term would be different, that they would have higher expectations of India on the tariff issue. And I think, the Indians played it smartly. They came in and tried to, preemptively reduce tariffs to create some goodwill with President Trump, and I think it helped, and immediately launched into fast-track trade negotiations after Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington. The trade officials have been going back and forth between the capitals, negotiating furiously. So I think that there's a better chance that India and the US are able to come to some kind of trade deal before many of the other countries.
Interesting you say that, Ms. Curtis, but also there is this feeling that since a trade deal, which was at that time called a mini trade deal, in the Trump administration's first tenure, do you think that particular draft will be sort of refreshed and it will be done by this fall? Because we also are hearing from the Commerce Ministry in India that they don't want to sign a deal under pressure, and there will be hardcore negotiations happening, so to say. But do you think it will be feasible to revive that particular trade deal, update it a bit, and then get it signed by the fall?
Well, I think they already have an updated draft that they're working on, and they have been working on over the last several weeks. How much it looks like the draft from the Trump 1 administration, I'm not particularly sure about that. But what I will say is that in the first Trump term, negotiations had been happening. President Trump got frustrated, imposed. He actually revoked India's GSP trade privileges in 2019. negotiations continued, and even during President Trump's visit to India in 2020, they were still negotiating, and India then at that point put on the table this mini trade deal, which President Trump, ultimately rejected. So they weren't even able to do a mini trade deal in the Trump's first term. So my sense is that this new deal will have to be more than maybe what was put forward in the mini trade deal back in 2020.
Also, coming to the fact that, what we recently heard External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar tell us is the fact that nothing in trade, there is nothing called a global trade anymore. There is nothing called purely investment and business. It's all very personal. And there is this overarching feeling within India right now that when Trump is talking and calling India tariff king and imposing tariffs, this is giving out a sort of negative signals. Do you think this is going to impact the strategic partnership as well?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Modi has dealt with President Trump in the past. I think he understands his psyche. He understands, his rhetoric and how he, says things publicly. So I think there is a certain amount of understanding there. So I don't expect that when President Trump, refers to India as tariff king or talks about how high Indian tariffs are, I don't think that's going to impact the trade discussions very much. I think only if it becomes a domestic issue here in India. If you start to hear the Indian public pushing back or not appreciating some of President Trump's references to India, then that could impact things. But I don't think that Prime Minister Modi himself or his senior advisors are bothered too much. I think they are have gotten used to this kind of negotiating tactic, because that's what it is.
Right.
Always before India and the U.S. were getting ready to sit down for a trade negotiation, 1-2 days ahead of time, Trump would tweet out something about India having the highest tariffs in the world, being the tariff king. So I think it was really seen as a negotiating tactic, and that's how it will be viewed in the future.
Right. And Ms. Curtis, you've also dealt with, apart from, of course, dealing with strategic issues on India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, in South Asia, you've also dealt a great deal on tariff policies. Now, do you think just by reducing tariffs on, let's say, a bourbon whiskey or a Harley Davidson bikes, this is not going to satisfy President Trump, right, or the administration? They would need, and US would need, more market access in India. So what do you think ideally can India do to sort of calm down this rhetoric on tariff and get a fruitful, mutually beneficial BTA, so to say?
Yeah, my understanding is that India is very aware what President Trump is looking for in terms of reducing tariffs, and is pretty much willing to meet the United States halfway on these issues. I think the one issue where there could be some friction is on agricultural issues. I think that's a real red line for Prime Minister Modi. 50% of the Indian population, works in the ag sector. It's very important. It's politically
it's very
it's a politically hot, sensitive issue. So I think that's the one area where we may see a bit of friction, because it's also an important sector for the United States as well. So I think that's the real test. Can they work through their differences over the ag issue?
I think that will be the real sort of stumbling block, and the difficult negotiations will happen there. Now, coming to the strategic aspect and the fact that India is also, tells the world that India is the major defense partner, and we saw some very interesting discussions happening when Prime Minister Modi was there. But we are not hearing much from the second Trump administration in terms of Indo-Pacific and what it wants to do. Can you tell us what is the focus do you think this government will have going forward as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned? Because India's neighborhood now is also in a turmoil, so to say, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. So where does all that leaves us?
I think we have started to see the outlines of an Indo-Pacific strategy. I say that because, we had the very positive visits of Prime Minister Modi as well as the Japanese Prime Minister, within a few weeks of President Trump taking office. Both those visits went very well. You had Secretary of State Marco Rubio holding a Quad foreign ministers meeting literally on the first day he was in office. You had the defense secretary traveling to Japan and the Philippines just last week and sort of, rededicating the U.S. To its alliance commitments to both nations. We also have heard about the interim defense strategic guidance. It's a classified document that's circulating in the Defense Department, but parts of it have been leaked to the Washington Post, so the Washington Post has been reporting on it. And it sounds like there's a very strong focus on defending Taiwan, on making sure that the U.S. Increases its military posture, its military troop levels, its stockpiling weapons, and other stocks in the region, and working with allies and partners to deter China from taking any military action toward Taiwan or in the South China Sea. So to me, that sounds like a lot of continuity from both the first Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy through the Biden administration strategy. I think we see a lot of continuity there. Now, the one question that has come up really has revolved around China and Taiwan. Because, the Taiwanese are looking at the fact that President Trump has equivocated on U.S. support to the Ukraine. And so they worry that President Trump could potentially withdraw support for Taiwan or put Taiwan on the negotiating table in his desire to get a trade deal with China. So I think that this won't happen. There is tremendous support for Taiwan in the U.S. Congress. And for all the reasons I just spelled out, I think there are many China hawks in the administration, people who take the China threat very seriously. So I think President Trump's hands would be tied in that respect. So he would not be able to just throw Taiwan under the bus, and sort of be compelled to maintain strong commitment to Taiwan. But these are concerns that are circulating within Taiwan.
Interesting you say this, because now very soon the US Vice President, Mr. J.D. Vance, is expected in India. And I'm sure there will be discussions mostly on tariff, trade, and the BTA. But there will be, I guess, also kind of discussions happening on the Quad Summit that India will be hosting for the first time, for which we are expecting President Trump to be here in Delhi. Do you think this China-Taiwan issue is going to come up there? And also, we are also hearing facts that from reports that maybe this time US would want India to come out more openly against China within the Quad security framework and not talk about other issues.
Well, I think that there's definitely a commitment to the Quad from the Trump administration. Of course, it's the first Trump administration that revived the Quad after having been, dead for 10 years. So there's very much a commitment to the Quad. I think the Trump administration will want to whittle down the number of issues. I think it's, gotten quite sprawling with, dozens of different working groups. So I think we'll see the agenda pared down to some of those really critical issues like maritime security, technology cooperation, critical minerals. These types of issues will be the focus of the Quad. There may be a push to talk more about military issues, maybe even talk about contingency planning for a potential crisis or contingency in the Indo-Pacific region. But I think India would resist making the Quad more of a security or defense forum, at least publicly. India has two reasons for that. It doesn't want to provoke China and see another border crisis like 2020. But also, I think India wants to maintain the soft power credentials of the Quad with the other Indo-Pacific nations. I think India realizes it's important to maintain support for the Quad among the Southeast Asian nations and other nations of the region. Whereas there may be a bit of a push from the Trump administration to securitize the Quad more, make it more focused on military issues, I expect India will continue to resist that. And we can't have the Quad without India, so India's views will have to be respected in that forum.
But how is the present Trump administration viewing this recent sort of resetting of ties between India and China? Because now, after the second or third phase of disengagement between India and China in some of the friction areas, although the military standoff kind of remains in eastern sector of Ladakh, we are going to probably now, India is saying that it will start some of the 5-6 points with China in terms of resumption of visa, direct flights, and also the pilgrimage tour in Kailash Mansarovar. How is US viewing it? Is the US okay with the fact that yes, India and China are again talking to each other? What is it? What is the thinking going on?
Well, look, nobody wants to see conflict on the border between India and China. It's a very dangerous situation, two major Asian powers, both with nuclear arms. So any diffusion of that crisis is welcome in the United States. And so, as long as India isn't sacrificing any of its territory or allowing China to coerce or intimidate, which I don't think is happening. I think India has stood its ground in terms of its position that it would not want to normalize relations with China until Chinese troop positions returned to the status quo ante of May 2020. So I think as long as China's not able to change facts on the ground through military force, the U.S. would be supportive of the two sides diffusing their tensions. I think too often India and the U.S. both look at the relations of the other with China very simplistically, and that if there's just one move to talk with China or open dialogue, the other side gets paranoid that maybe they're improving relations too much. But the reality is both India and the United States have huge trading relationships with China.
Right.
Well, of course, now China and the U.S. have
Having
just
their own
entered a
kind
trade
of
war. But, in general, both countries are going to have to interact with China and have a certain level of relationship. And I think that India and the U.S. by now should have a strong enough understanding and trust in their own strategic partnership to not be so paranoid if one of the countries decides to try to incrementally improve their relationship with China.
Now, let me shift your focus to the defense partnership very quickly, in the sense we heard after a very long time, US is again willing to sell the F-35 fighter jets to India. India, of course, as you're aware, has its own sort of reservations and issues. But where do you think the defense partnership is sort of shaping up? Because, of course, we again hear that this is going to be more transactional. US would like to sell more, and India, of course, needs more weaponry. But then there is this cost factor. Where do you see things sort of kind of coming to a point? And also, will there be the threat of CAATSA coming in? Because that's something, everybody is waiting to see what's happening, because India has a lot of weaponry purchases lined up as far as Russia is concerned.
Well, look, I think that the U.S.-India defense and security partnership is in very good shape. And I think what we saw in the joint statement between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi was a commitment to that part of the relationship. That was, the first thing mentioned in the joint statement was defense and security partnership. And you're right, the U.S. held out the possibility of India taking the F-35, which was, I think, a very symbolic statement about U.S. willingness to provide India with its most sophisticated defense technology and having kind of faith and confidence that the relationship was moving in that direction. Now that said, the F-35s are very expensive. This would be a huge budget outlay for India. And number two, there are security requirements that India would have to meet before such a transaction could take place. But it's something to think about for the future. In terms of CAATSA, this issue has not come up in the United States. Nobody's talking about CAATSA. But what they are talking about is the expectation that India is reducing, not increasing, its reliance on Russian military gear. I think it would be problematic if we started to see Indian,
an uptick.
An uptick, yes, because we have seen a gradual reduction, and I think U.S. officials expect that to continue in that trend, the trend downward, because it could be problematic for future U.S.-India ability to cooperate on high-tech items if India were to increase its reliance on Russian military gear.
Sure, I think we need to see that for the future. And my very last question, of course, saving the best for the last, to understand the counterterrorism, partnership that's going on, and we are seeing at very early days of the Trump administration already that partnership evolving in the sense the extradition of Tahawoor Rana. Then there is this question now coming in that we need to also have the main mastermind out here, David Headley. So just to understand from you, do you think that discussion will now start that, why don't you hand over David Coleman Headley to us?
I don't think so. He's in a different category. He made a plea deal with the United States. So in our court system, that is not something that you can change or overturn. So I don't think that discussion will happen. That's my sense. Of course, the U.S.-India counterterrorism partnership will remain strong. They'll find other ways to cooperate. I'm sure this will be a priority for the Trump administration. But I don't think we can infer that because Tahawoor Rana was extradited that David Headley will be next. I think that's a much different issue.
Thank you so much for the conversation. So that was Ms. Lisa Curtis talking to us about where the India-US relationship is headed, where the defense partnership is headed, and of course, what are we going to expect in terms of the tariff and the bilateral trade agreement. For The Gist, this is Nayanima Basu. Thank you for watching.